Hello everyone, I'm the Storyteller, here to guide you through tonight's chilling tales. If these stories help you unwind or drift off to sleep, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. It truly makes a difference in bringing more stories your way. I'd also love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always amazing to connect with listeners around the world. So take a deep breath, settle in, and get ready for a night of mystery and suspense. It was a cold, drizzly night when I found myself waiting at the nearly empty train station on the outskirts of town. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, echoing through the dimly lit terminal. The place had a haunting stillness to it, with its flickering lights and cracked tiles that hinted at years of neglect. A single janitor shuffled around, sweeping dust across the floor in a lazy circle. I was alone, save for an elderly man dozing off on a bench and a teenage girl buried in her phone. My phone had died hours ago, and I had no idea how long I'd have to wait for the last train. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. The station's emptiness seemed to amplify the low hum of the fluorescent lights, and the shadows stretched and bent as if they had a life of their own. As I glanced down the track, I saw it, the faint glow of headlights slowly emerging from the darkness. The train was approaching, but something felt off. It was completely silent, gliding down the track without making a single sound, as if it was hovering just above the rails. My stomach churned with an uneasy feeling, but I brushed it off. After all, I was tired and just wanted to get home. When the train finally came to a stop, I noticed that it was eerily old-fashioned. The carriages were black with intricate ironwork details, looking like something out of a forgotten era. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing an empty car with dim yellow lights casting long shadows across the seats. Hesitating for a moment, I stepped on board, half expecting someone to join me, but neither the elderly man nor the girl budged from their seats. I felt their eyes on me as the doors closed, and the train jolted forward, moving faster than I had anticipated. I looked out the window, only to find a thick fog had settled over the tracks, obscuring everything outside. The first few minutes were quiet. The steady rhythm of the train moving down the track was almost hypnotic, and I felt my eyes getting heavy. But then, I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from somewhere in the car behind me. I froze, my skin prickling as the whisper grew louder, muttering incoherent words. Slowly I turned to see if someone had boarded the train without my noticing, but the car was empty. I shrugged it off as my imagination, convincing myself it was just the sound of the train. Yet, as the journey continued, the whispers became clearer, morphing into distinct voices. They weren't speaking in any language I recognized, and they seemed to overlap, like multiple people speaking in hushed tones. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I got up, thinking maybe I'd just walk down the train to see if there were any other passengers. As I passed through each car, though, I realized they were all empty, stretching on, as if the train was far longer than it had seemed when I boarded. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw someone sitting at the very end of one car. It was a man, dressed in a dark suit, with a hat that obscured most of his face. He was sitting perfectly still, facing the window, not acknowledging me as I approached. "Excuse me," I said, my voice echoing in the empty car. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look, when suddenly, he turned his head just enough that I could see his face, or rather, the lack of one. His skin was stretched taut where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, as if he had been molded from wax and left unfinished. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as he slowly raised a gloved hand and pointed to the empty seat beside him. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling the car with a cacophony of eerie murmurs. Gathering every ounce of courage, I forced myself to turn and rush back toward the door, determined to leave this nightmare behind. But as I sprinted through the cars, each one seemed to twist and stretch, the lights dimming and flickering erratically. The doors between cars slammed shut on their own, forcing me to pry them open with trembling hands. I finally reached the door that led back to the platform, slamming it open with a sense of relief. But when I stepped out, I realized I was not at the station I'd started from. In fact, it didn't seem like a station at all. I was in a cavernous, underground space that felt ancient. The walls were lined with crumbling stone, and dim torches cast eerie shadows that danced across the floor. There were no signs, no directions, just an endless, dark passageway leading off into the unknown. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw the faceless man stepping off the train, moving in my direction with deliberate, slow strides. Panicking, I ran down the passageway, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. As I turned corner after corner, I found myself lost in a maze of corridors, each one more narrow and claustrophobic than the last. The air grew colder, and I could feel something unseen pressing in around me, whispering in my ear, filling my mind with images of things I couldn't understand. Finally, I reached a door at the end of the hallway. Without thinking, I threw it open and stumbled through, finding myself back at the station where I had started. Everything seemed normal, as if I'd never left. The clock on the wall showed the same time, and the elderly man and teenage girl were still sitting on the benches, just as they had been when I boarded the train. But when I turned back to look at the tracks, the train was gone. For a moment I wondered if I'd imagined everything. But as I glanced down, I noticed something clutched in my hand. A worn black ticket with faded letters that read, "The Last Train." And then, from somewhere far away, I heard the faint echo of that whisper, drifting through the air like a distant memory. To this day, I can't bring myself to set foot in a train station, and every Halloween, I dream of that faceless man waiting in the dark, waiting for the next passenger to board the last train to nowhere. I was never one to get sucked into TikTok trends. But one late night, out of boredom, I downloaded the app to kill some time. Scrolling mindlessly, I stumbled across a profile that stood out. It didn't have a profile picture, and the username was just a string of random letters and numbers. Something like YXJ39G8. There were no followers, no bio, and yet, the account was filled with videos. Curiosity got the better of me, so I tapped on the first video. It was dark, grainy footage of a forest, trees swaying slightly as if someone were filming while hiding behind them. The only sound was a faint crackling, like static, and the occasional snap of a branch. The video ended abruptly, and as I swiped to the next one, a chill ran down my spine. The second video was a shot of an empty room, bare walls, a single chair in the center. The camera was shaky, as if someone was struggling to hold it still. A faint whisper echoed in the background, but I couldn't make out the words. Just before the video ended, the door behind the chair creaked open ever so slightly. My heart raced as I watched, but I couldn't look away. Video after video, they were all like that. Eerie, unsettling, as if each clip was filmed from somewhere forbidden. One was a video of a hallway with flickering lights. Another showed what looked like a basement, with dark, damp walls covered in strange, hand-drawn symbols. I noticed that every video seemed to be filmed by someone hiding, watching, waiting. I was about to exit the app, but I noticed a notification. I'd gotten a message from the account. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, expecting some creepy prank or glitch. But the message was just a single word. "Hello." I hesitated, but after a moment I typed back, "Who are you?" Within seconds they responded, "I'm someone you know." My blood ran cold. This was obviously just a prank, I told myself. But something felt off. My curiosity outweighed my fear, so I asked, "Why are you sending me these videos?" The reply came quickly, "You're in them too." Confused, I scrolled back through the videos, searching for any sign of myself. None of the videos showed my face, my room, or anything familiar. But then, I reached the last video posted. It had been uploaded just moments before, and it had no likes, no comments. I hesitated before hitting play. It started with the usual static, but then the camera shifted, panning across a dark room, and my heart stopped. It was my bedroom. The view moved from my bed to my closet, then toward my window, just like my room looked at that exact moment. I froze, unable to move or even blink. The video was filmed from somewhere high, like someone had been watching me from the corner of the ceiling. Then, just as the camera panned down, revealing what looked like a shadowed figure lurking by the door, the screen went black. My hands were shaking. I stumbled up, reaching for the light switch, but just as my fingers grazed it, my phone buzzed. A notification. It was another message from the account. Turn around. I felt a cold, prickling sensation on the back of my neck. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly, very slowly turned. But the room was empty. Just me and the quiet hum of the fan in the corner. Another notification. I glanced down, and there it was, a new video. My heart hammered as I opened it. The footage was shaky, but this time it showed the view from behind my bed, inching closer to where I stood. I was watching myself, watching the video, and I could see myself glancing over my shoulder, just like I'd done seconds ago. I dropped my phone, my mind racing. This had to be some kind of sick joke, some elaborate hack. But as I scrambled to pick my phone back up, another message popped up. I'm closer now. The message was followed by another video notification. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to throw my phone away, to just get out, but something compelled me to watch. In the clip, the camera had moved closer to my bed, the angle slightly tilted, as if whoever was filming was crouching now. I could see myself, my wide eyes staring into the screen, my breathing shallow and fast. Then, from behind me in the video, a shadow shifted, drawing closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I slowly turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one there. My phone buzzed with another message, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I backed away from the bed, heart pounding, eyes darting around the room. I could feel something watching, just beyond the edge of the shadows, but I couldn't see it. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. Taking a deep breath, I mustered the courage to look at the phone once more. The message was short and chilling. Check your closet. I stared at my closet door, slightly ajar, darkness spilling out from the crack. My chest tightened and I felt frozen in place, but I couldn't resist. My hand trembled as I reached out, pulling the door open wider. Nothing. The closet was empty, just clothes and shadows. I laughed nervously, relief flooding me for a brief moment, but then my phone buzzed again. Another video. In it, the camera was focused on my closet, on me standing there, looking inside. And from somewhere in the shadows, a pale hand emerged, reaching out toward me. I could see my own face in the video, my eyes widening in horror as the hand moved closer. The video ended just as I whipped around, but my room was empty. I bolted out the door, my heart racing, running out of the apartment without even thinking of where I'd go. I never returned to that room. And to this day, I don't open TikTok. But sometimes in the dead of night, I can still feel that cold, oppressive gaze, and I wonder if it's still watching, waiting for me to slip up and look again. I never believed in supernatural things, especially not dolls. To me, they were just childhood toys, harmless and lifeless. But that all changed when I moved into my new apartment. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood. One day, while I was unpacking boxes, I found an old, dusty box buried at the bottom of one of the moving crates. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity piqued, I opened it. Inside was a porcelain doll. Her face was pale, her eyes a haunting shade of blue, and her black hair was neatly tied in pigtails. She wore an old-fashioned dress that was slightly torn at the edges, and there was something about her smile, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a smile of joy or innocence. It was cold, almost menacing. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the doll belonged to the previous tenants, or maybe it had just been forgotten in the chaos of moving. I decided to place her on a shelf in the living room, figuring it would make for an interesting conversation piece. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint noises from the living room. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself it was just the wind or the creaks of the apartment settling. But the noises persisted. Soft tapping sounds, almost like a child knocking on a door. I shrugged it off and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, the doll was gone. I checked the living room, thinking I had perhaps moved it in my sleep or misplaced it somehow. But no, she wasn't on the shelf or anywhere in sight. A chill ran down my spine as I searched every corner of the room, but there was no trace of the doll. That's when I noticed something odd. The small wooden chair I kept by the window was slightly turned, as if someone had moved it. I was alone, I reminded myself. There was no one else in the apartment. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later that day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head, but the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. Who had moved it? Where had it gone? The more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more they seemed to consume me. When I returned to the apartment, the doll was back on the shelf, exactly where I had left her. But this time, her smile was wider, more sinister, and her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but things only got worse. Over the next few days, I noticed more strange occurrences. I would wake up to find doors that I was sure I had locked, wide open. Items in the kitchen would be moved around, and sometimes I would hear faint footsteps when no one was there. The worst moment came a week later. I had just gotten out of the shower and was standing in front of the bathroom mirror when I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Play with me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one. The voice had come from inside the apartment, and yet there was nothing. No one. I rushed into the living room, but the doll was gone again. This time, though, I didn't waste time looking around. I knew where she was. I bolted into the bedroom, opened the closet, and there she was, sitting in the corner, staring at me. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, and her smile seemed even wider, almost mocking. I backed away, my heart pounding, but I couldn't stop myself from feeling the pull, the urge to pick her up, to hold her. It was like she was calling to me, whispering in my ear. I snapped out of it, shaking my head and forcing myself to leave the apartment. I wasn't sure where I was going, just anywhere but here. But as I stepped out the door, I heard the voice again, louder this time. "Come back to me." I couldn't run fast enough. I don't know what happened to that doll. I left the apartment and never returned. To this day, I don't know if it was just a product of my imagination or something much darker, but I can't shake the feeling that the doll is still out there, waiting for me to return, waiting for me to play, and I have no doubt that it's still watching. When my partner and I finally bought our first house, it was supposed to be a new beginning, a place for us and our dog, Max, to settle in and build our lives. The house was an old Victorian, charming and with just the right amount of character. We thought it had a sense of warmth and history. Little did we know that it would soon start feeling different. Max had always been a calm, gentle dog, a golden retriever with the sweetest temperament. But the moment we moved into the house, something shifted. Max's behavior started to change. He became restless, constantly pacing the halls, whining at corners, and occasionally barking at seemingly nothing. The first night, as we were unpacking boxes in the living room, Max kept his eyes glued to the staircase. His ears were perked, his body tense, as if he was watching something invisible. I tried calling his name, snapping my fingers, but he wouldn't break his gaze. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he turned to me, whimpering, as if he wanted to tell me something. I shrugged it off as him adjusting to the new place. A few nights later, I woke up to find Max standing at the foot of our bed, his entire body frozen in a rigid stance. He was staring intently toward the doorway, his eyes wide and unblinking. I tried to reassure him, gently patting his head, but he was unresponsive. It was like he was in some kind of trance, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. The nights following became even stranger. Max would stand at the base of the staircase and bark, sometimes growling, his eyes fixed on the top step. At first I thought maybe he was just unsettled by the new surroundings, so I tried to take him around the house to show him there was nothing to be afraid of. But that only seemed to make things worse. One night, as I was preparing for bed, I noticed Max standing in front of the large mirror in the hallway. His reflection was off. It wasn't just that he looked scared. There was a shadowy figure standing behind him in the mirror. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, and when I looked back, it was gone. But Max was still standing there, whimpering and trembling, looking over his shoulder as if he knew something was there, even though I couldn't see it. The final straw came one stormy night. The wind was howling, the rain pounding against the windows, and there was a chill in the air that no amount of blankets could chase away. Max was lying on the bed with us, but at exactly 3 a.m., he jumped up, barking at the top of his lungs. His hackles were raised, and he was growling viciously at the bedroom door. I opened the door, my heart racing, trying to figure out what was causing his distress. But as soon as the door swung open, he bolted down the hallway, his growls echoing off the walls. My partner and I followed him, trying to calm him down, but he was relentless, his gaze fixed on the basement door. When we reached the basement, Max refused to go down the stairs, standing guard as if protecting us from whatever was down there. His growls grew louder, more desperate, until finally, we had no choice but to open the door. As we slowly descended the creaky wooden steps, a freezing gust of air rushed past us, carrying with it a faint whispering sound. It was like someone was murmuring just beyond our sight, words we couldn't quite make out. The basement was pitch dark, the only light coming from a small window in the far corner. But as we reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something in the shadows, a figure standing there, half hidden in the darkness. My partner turned on her phone's flashlight, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a face, a pale, twisted face staring back at us. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. We rushed back upstairs, slamming the door shut behind us, our breaths coming in shallow gasps. Max was still at the top of the stairs, his body tense, watching us intently. When we were finally back in the bedroom, he lay down at the door, as if guarding us from whatever had been in the basement. The next morning, I contacted the previous owners, hoping they could offer some explanation. They hesitated at first, but eventually they admitted that they had experienced similar disturbances in the house, especially with their own dog. Apparently, the house had a tragic past. Decades ago, a family had lived there, but the father had gone missing one night, never to be seen again. People in the town believed he had been hiding out in the basement, driven mad by something in the house. From that day on, we never went down to the basement again. Max's behavior gradually returned to normal, though he still kept his distance from the basement door, often standing guard by it, as if he was making sure nothing ever escaped. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night in the basement, or what Max was so afraid of. All I know is that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that only the most sensitive souls, like Max, can sense. And though I still live in the house, there's a part of me that will always wonder what's waiting in the shadows, down in that dark, silent basement, just beyond the reach of the light. We'd all heard the stories growing up, the rumors about the old Blackwood Asylum on the edge of town. Built in the 1930s, it was originally a psychiatric hospital for patients with severe mental illness. It had shut down decades ago under strange circumstances, with some locals claiming that a mysterious illness had swept through the hospital, forcing its closure. Since then, it had become a place of legend, a forbidden zone no one dared to enter. But on one chilly October night, my friends and I decided to take the risk. There were 5 of us: me, Eric, Sarah, Jen, and Mark. We weren't superstitious, and the stories just sounded like urban legends, exaggerated to scare kids. So we packed some flashlights, a couple of snacks, and a camcorder, hoping to capture a spooky experience we could laugh about later. We arrived at the asylum just before midnight. The building loomed above us, shrouded in darkness. Ivy covered the walls, and the windows were either broken or missing entirely. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant owl. As we pushed open the rusty gates, they let out an eerie, drawn-out creak, as if warning us to stay away. We walked through the overgrown courtyard, past a crumbling fountain, and into the main entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Dust coated everything, and our footsteps echoed down the long, empty hallways. Each room we passed seemed untouched, as if frozen in time. Patient records, old metal bed frames, and broken furniture lay scattered around, remnants of the hospital's disturbing past. As we ventured deeper into the asylum, a strange feeling began to creep over us. I noticed Jen shivering, even though she'd brought a thick coat. Sarah, normally talkative and brave, had gone quiet, her eyes darting nervously around as if she expected something to jump out at her. And then we heard it. At first it was faint, barely audible, a distant hum, like someone singing softly. We froze, exchanging glances, trying to determine if any of us had imagined it. But as we stood there in silence, the humming grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere deeper inside the building. Who could that be? Eric whispered, his face pale. Probably just the wind or an animal, Mark muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. But the sound continued, a soft, lilting tune that sent chills down my spine. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, yet there was something terribly wrong about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The melody seemed haunted, like a lullaby sung by someone who'd lost their mind. We followed the sound down a narrow corridor lined with old patient rooms. The further we went, the louder it became, until it was echoing all around us. By the time we reached the end of the hallway, we could make out words, though they were faint and difficult to understand. The voice was high-pitched, and it seemed to waver, like it was both close and far away at the same time. Just as we reached a large empty room that had once been the common area, the singing stopped abruptly, plunging us into silence. Our flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, the voice began again, closer this time. It was no longer a gentle lullaby, but a slow, haunting chant. The words sounded distorted, garbled, as though they were coming from a broken record. I couldn't understand them, but they seemed to claw into my mind, filling me with an unexplainable dread. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. She pointed toward the far end of the room, where a figure stood, barely illuminated by the weak glow of our flashlights. It was a woman dressed in an old hospital gown, her long hair hanging over her face. She was swaying slightly, her mouth moving as if singing, though no sound was coming out. We all took a step back, our hearts pounding. The woman's head jerked up, and I caught a glimpse of her eyes, hollow, empty, like they were staring right through us. Without warning, she began to walk toward us, her steps slow but deliberate, her mouth still moving in that horrible, silent song. "Run!" Mark shouted, snapping us out of our paralysis. We turned and bolted down the hallway, our footsteps echoing as we sprinted back toward the entrance. But as we ran, the song began again, louder and more distorted, as if it was coming from every corner of the building. Just as we reached the front doors, they slammed shut, trapping us inside. Eric yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The singing grew louder, now echoing through the halls, surrounding us. Frantically, we searched for another way out, eventually finding a broken window near the side of the building. One by one, we climbed through, cutting ourselves on the jagged glass in our desperation to escape. When I looked back, I saw the woman standing in the doorway, her head tilted, watching us with those empty, lifeless eyes. We didn't stop running until we were far from the asylum, the haunting song still echoing in our minds. To this day, none of us can explain what we saw, or who, or what, had been singing that terrifying lullaby. We had hoped to find an adventure, maybe even a little thrill, but what we found was something far darker, something that still haunts us, even now. And I'll never forget that melody, echoing in the dead of night, like a song for the lost souls of Blackwood Asylum. It was my second month working the night shift at the Carlton Hotel, and I was still getting used to the eerie quiet that filled the place after midnight. The Carlton was an old building, built in the early 1900s, and while it had been renovated many times, it still held a vintage charm. But with that charm came odd creaks, flickering lights, and unexplained drafts that always seemed to follow you down the hallways. I was on my usual rounds, checking the empty conference rooms and locking up doors when I noticed something strange. The hallway leading to room 407 had a peculiar draft that night, a cold breeze that felt out of place. Normally that hallway was dead silent, but tonight I could swear I heard a faint tapping sound echoing from down the corridor. I made my way toward room 407, feeling the hairs on my arms prickle as I got closer. The door was slightly ajar, though I was certain all the rooms had been locked. Curious and maybe a little nervous, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Room 407 was just like every other room. Standard furniture, tasteful decor, and a bed that hadn't been slept in for a while. I was about to leave, chalking the open door up to forgetfulness, when I noticed something unusual. One of the walls had a faint outline of a door. It was barely noticeable, but under the dim glow of the bedside lamp I could see it. A small square indentation in the wall, hidden beneath the wallpaper. Intrigued, I touched the outline, running my fingers over the edges. To my surprise, the wall gave way slightly. It wasn't just a marking, it was an actual door, hidden behind layers of paint and wallpaper. I hesitated, wondering if I should just walk away, but the curiosity was too strong. I grabbed the edge and carefully pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway that seemed to go deep into the walls of the hotel. The smell hit me immediately, a stale, earthy odor, mixed with something metallic, almost like rust. I took out my flashlight, the beam barely cutting through the thick darkness ahead. My heart pounded as I took a tentative step inside. The passageway was tight, barely wide enough for me to walk through without brushing my shoulders against the walls. Every step I took echoed down the narrow corridor, making it feel like someone was following right behind me. The further I went, the colder the air became, until it felt like I was walking into a freezer. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the passage. It opened into a small room, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were lined with strange symbols carved into the concrete. They were old, faded, but the markings seemed deliberate, like some ritualistic language I couldn't understand. In the center of the room, there was a small wooden table, and on it lay an old leather-bound book. Dust covered the book, but it looked out of place, like someone had left it there recently. I picked it up, and as I brushed off the dust, I saw a name written on the cover. Property of T.H. Carlton. My mind raced. T.H. Carlton was the founder of the hotel, and he had disappeared mysteriously in 1925. No one knew what had happened to him, and the story had become part of the hotel's folklore. Some said he had vanished into thin air. Others believed he had hidden a fortune somewhere in the building. I opened the book, flipping through its yellowed pages. It seemed to be a diary, with entries written in a hurried, frantic hand. The entries spoke of strange things, whispers in the walls, voices that called to him in the night, and shadows that moved on their own. Suddenly I heard a noise, a faint shuffle, like footsteps coming from the passageway. My pulse quickened. I turned off my flashlight, holding my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the narrow corridor. Someone or something was coming. Panic surged through me as I looked around, desperate for a place to hide. But the room was too small, and there was nowhere to go. I backed up against the wall, gripping the book tightly, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. In the darkness, I could barely make out a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its face was hidden in shadow. It just stood there, silent, unmoving, as if it were watching me.
Then, without warning, it stepped forward. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the book, as the figure reached out a long, bony hand toward me.
Just then, the flashlight in my pocket flickered back on, casting a beam of light across the figure's face. But there was no face, only a hollow, empty void where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. The figure recoiled from the light, hissing as it retreated back into the darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted out of the room, my flashlight swinging wildly as I stumbled down the passageway. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against me as I ran, and I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, growing closer with every second. Finally, I burst out of the hidden door and into room 407, slamming the wall shut behind me. The tapping noise had returned, louder than before, echoing through the walls. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, clutching the book in my hands. I didn't stop running until I reached the hotel lobby. My manager looked up, startled, as I collapsed onto one of the lobby chairs, drenched in sweat and unable to form words. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he just gave me a concerned look, like he thought I was losing my mind. Later that night, when I finally calmed down, I went back to room 407 with a group of hotel staff. But when we examined the wall, the hidden door was gone, as if it had never existed. The diary I'd brought with me was the only proof that anything had happened at all. I left the hotel a few days later, unable to shake the memory of that faceless figure in the darkness. Sometimes I think I can still hear the faint tapping echoing in my mind, like a reminder of something ancient and malevolent that lurks within the walls of the Carlton Hotel. And I know that hidden door is still there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to find it. It started as a dare, a harmless challenge between friends. The four of us had been sitting around the campfire on a cool autumn night, swapping ghost stories and trying to one-up each other with tales of hauntings. Eventually, someone brought up the old cemetery at the edge of town, a place that had been abandoned for decades. Overgrown, neglected, and supposedly cursed, it was the perfect setting for a night of urban exploration. We decided that we would go at midnight, armed with flashlights and an odd sense of bravery that only comes with being surrounded by friends. We trekked to the edge of town, our laughter and banter masking the nervousness we all felt. The gate of the cemetery creaked ominously as we pushed it open, revealing rows of moss-covered tombstones barely visible under the pale moonlight. The cemetery was silent, too silent. Not even the sound of crickets or the rustling of leaves. It felt as though we'd stepped into a different world, a place where time had stopped. The deeper we walked, the more unsettled I became. Shadows danced across the stones, and every once in a while, I could swear I saw something moving out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, there was nothing. We reached the heart of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay, their inscriptions worn away by time. It was there that we saw it, a small porcelain doll sitting on top of an unmarked grave. The doll was pristine, despite being in the middle of this forgotten place. Its face was painted with a delicate smile, its eyes wide and staring, with a slight glint that made it seem disturbingly lifelike. "Who would leave a doll here?" one of my friends whispered, his voice shaky. We crowded around the grave, examining the doll in uneasy silence. It was dressed in a white, lacy dress that looked out of place against the decaying tombstones and overgrown grass. Its hands were positioned delicately on its lap, and its eyes seemed to follow us, almost as if it were waiting. Maybe it belonged to a kid buried here, another friend suggested, though none of us could remember any stories about children being buried in the cemetery. This grave, like many others around it, was nameless, worn down by years of neglect. Then one of my friends, let's call him Chris, did something we all regretted. He reached out and picked up the doll, laughing as he held it in front of us. "Look, she's cute," he joked, waving it around. But the doll's face seemed to change in his hands, its once gentle smile looking darker, more twisted. "Put it back," I whispered, feeling a chill creep down my spine. But Chris only laughed, pretending to make the doll dance in his hands. The moment he did, a gust of cold wind swept through the cemetery, strong enough to make us all shiver. We looked around, our flashlights flickering as if the batteries were suddenly dying. "I think we should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But Chris just shrugged, cradling the doll like it was a prize. As we turned to leave, the atmosphere grew heavy, like something was watching us, closing in. Halfway through the cemetery, we heard it, a faint whispering voice so soft it was almost drowned out by our footsteps. "Come back," it whispered, the words slithering through the air like a chill. Chris stopped, his face paling. Did you guys hear that?" he stammered. None of us answered, but we'd all heard it. The whisper grew louder, its tone laced with a strange mix of longing and anger. "Come back," it repeated, the voice closer this time, as if following us. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a run, our footsteps echoing across the empty graves. But no matter how fast we ran, the whisper seemed to stay close, like it was right behind us. When we finally reached the gate, Chris stumbled, the doll falling from his hands onto the ground. The doll landed face down, and in the moonlight, I could see something chilling. Its head had cracked open from the fall, revealing a hollow, dark interior filled with old, yellowed teeth. They were small, like those of a child, but scattered haphazardly inside the doll's head, giving it a nightmarish appearance. We didn't wait. Leaving the doll behind, we sprinted out of the cemetery, too terrified to look back. None of us spoke on the way home, too shaken by what we'd seen and heard. That night, I lay in bed, trying to forget the doll's face, the whispering voice, and those horrible, hidden teeth. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Chris. The text was simple but horrifying. I think it followed me. The next day, Chris didn't show up for school. When we went to check on him, his mother told us he'd been up all night, talking to himself and refusing to leave his room. His eyes were wide, haunted, like he hadn't slept in days. He kept mumbling about whispers in the dark, and how he could see the doll's face every time he closed his eyes. Weeks passed, and Chris only got worse. The whispers hadn't stopped, he said. He heard them every night, calling him back to the cemetery. He tried to ignore them, but the voice grew angrier, more insistent. He would wake up with scratches on his arms, as though something was clawing at him in his sleep. Then, one night, he disappeared. His family searched everywhere, but there was no trace of him. The only clue was a note left on his bed, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "I'm going back to put her back." Despite everything, we were too scared to follow him, and Chris was never seen again. To this day, no one knows what happened to him, though some say they've seen a doll on the same grave where we found it. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, you can hear a faint whisper coming from the old cemetery, calling out, "Come back." It all started with a mystery video. The popular YouTuber, Alex Hart, known for his daring explorations of abandoned places and dangerous sites, had announced he was going to investigate an eerie, secluded cave deep in the mountains. According to the video he posted before the trip, the cave was rumored to be cursed. Some locals said that anyone who ventured too far into it would never return. But Alex didn't believe in curses. He laughed it off and promised his audience a thrilling video. But days went by after the upload, and there was only silence. His social media accounts remained untouched, and his channel sat quiet without any updates. Fans and followers began to worry. Theories started circulating online, some saying he'd gone too far and gotten lost, others claiming he'd staged the whole thing as a publicity stunt. But after weeks passed with no sign of him, even his most loyal fans had to accept that something was wrong. A few friends and I had been following his channel for years. We'd grown up watching his explorations, his encounters with strange sights, and his courageous dives into the unknown. One of my friends, Sam, was particularly affected. He'd always dreamed of joining Alex on one of his adventures, and now that Alex was missing, Sam felt personally responsible for figuring out what happened. So one Friday night, as we sat together in Sam's basement, He proposed a plan that would change our lives forever. "Let's go to the cave," he said, his voice low but determined. "If anyone can find him, it's us. We know his channel inside out. We've seen how he prepares, the routes he takes, and his routines. We can do this." After some discussion, we agreed. The idea was terrifying, but we were also curious. Besides, we couldn't stand the thought of Alex disappearing without a trace. We packed our bags, loaded up on flashlights, batteries, and some basic climbing gear, and set off early the next morning. The journey was long, winding through mountain roads and remote trails, but eventually we found the cave. The entrance was unassuming, a narrow opening hidden behind thick undergrowth. If we hadn't known exactly what to look for, we would have missed it entirely. Standing before it, though, I felt a sense of dread I couldn't shake. It was as if the darkness within the cave was alive, watching us, waiting. We steeled ourselves and entered, our flashlights cutting through the pitch-black interior. The cave was damp and silent, save for the occasional drip of water echoing through the passages. We followed Alex's likely route, based on the research he'd shared in his last video. Along the way, we found small signs that he'd been there, footprints in the mud, marks on the walls. But as we moved deeper, something began to feel wrong. The air grew colder and our flashlights seemed to dim slightly, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. We started hearing strange noises, soft whispers that echoed from the depths, or faint footsteps that seemed to follow us, yet disappeared whenever we stopped to listen. At first, we thought it was just our nerves playing tricks on us, but soon the noises became undeniable. Sam led the way, and he kept calling out Alex's name, hoping for any kind of response. But the only answer was our own voices bouncing back at us, distorted and strange. Then we found something chilling, a camera. It was Alex's, lying on the ground, cracked and covered in a thin layer of dust. We picked it up, hoping there'd be a clue on it, but it wouldn't turn on. It looked like it had been there for weeks, and we realized with a sinking feeling that we might be too late. Just as we were about to turn back, we noticed an odd marking on the wall beside the camera. It looked like a handprint, but larger and strangely shaped, with long claw-like fingers. Next to it, carved into the rock, was a single word: leave. That should have been our cue to go. Every instinct told me to run, but Sam was relentless. He insisted on going further, convinced that Alex was still out there, somewhere deeper inside. Reluctantly, we followed, pushing past our fear. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air became. It felt thick, almost suffocating. Our flashlights flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls, and the whispers grew louder, as if they were closing in on us. Suddenly, we heard a blood-chilling scream echoing through the cave, a scream that sounded eerily like Alex's voice. We froze, our hearts pounding. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. Against every survival instinct, we moved toward it, desperate to find him. The passageway led us into a massive chamber, and there, in the dim glow of our lights, we saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in dark, rusty stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. In the center of the chamber stood a figure, his back turned to us, motionless. "Alex!" Sam called out, his voice shaking. The figure turned slowly, and our flashlights caught his face. It was Alex, but he looked wrong. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and gaunt, and his expression was a twisted mixture of terror and madness. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he pointed at something behind us. We turned, and our flashlights illuminated a horrifying sight. Shadowy figures, tall and thin with elongated limbs, were emerging from the walls, their bodies blending with the shadows. They moved silently, their eyes glowing with a sinister light as they closed in on us. We didn't wait to see what they wanted. Grabbing Sam, I screamed for everyone to run. We sprinted back through the tunnels, the shadows chasing us, their whispers filling the air. I could feel them getting closer, reaching out for us, and I dared not look back. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the cave, collapsing on the ground outside. Gasping for breath, we looked around, but there was no sign of Alex. It was as if he'd vanished again, swallowed by the darkness. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that cave. Alex was never found, and the footage from his camera remains a mystery. But sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers calling me back to the cave, and I wonder if we ever should have gone looking for him at all. It was supposed to be a fun weekend escape. Just a few friends camping in the forest, roasting marshmallows, telling ghost stories, and enjoying the fresh air. We'd picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any trails or campsites, just to make sure we wouldn't run into other people. Or so we thought. The first day was perfect. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled around the campfire, joking and laughing as the sun dipped below the trees. By nightfall, we were sharing scary stories, letting the flickering firelight add to the atmosphere. The night was silent, except for the crackling of our fire and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Around midnight, just as we were about to head to our tents, a faint glow appeared in the distance. It was just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the branches. At first we thought it was another group of campers, but then one of my friends, Mike, pointed out that we were supposed to be miles away from the nearest campsite. Curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to check it out. We moved as quietly as we could, slipping between the trees, trying to stay hidden. As we got closer, the glow became clearer, a fire, bigger than ours, crackling with an intensity that lit up the surrounding trees. And around the fire, there was a group of people. They stood in a circle, their faces obscured by hoods, wearing dark, tattered cloaks that swayed in the breeze. There was something deeply unsettling about them. They moved in perfect unison, each one shifting slightly, their heads tilted toward the fire as if in reverence. But it wasn't just their appearance. It was the strange, low hum that filled the air, like a chant or a prayer in a language none of us recognized. We huddled together, watching from behind a tree, hoping they wouldn't notice us. One of my friends, Sarah, whispered that we should leave, that something about this felt wrong. But before we could turn back, one of the cloaked figures stepped forward, raising his hands toward the sky, his voice rising above the others in a chilling chant. The others joined in, their voices blending into a haunting melody that seemed to reverberate through the trees. The fire suddenly flared, casting eerie shadows across their faces, and we could finally see their expressions. Each one was twisted into a wide, unnatural smile, their eyes unfocused and glassy, as if they were in a trance. My heart pounded as I realized that none of them looked alive. Their skin was pale, almost gray, with dark circles around their eyes, and there was something disturbingly hollow about their faces, as if they were wearing masks of their own skin. Then, one by one, they began to turn, looking in our direction. It was as if they could sense us, feel our presence even though we hadn't made a sound. Their eyes locked onto ours and their smiles grew wider, stretching impossibly across their faces. The chanting grew louder, faster, filling the air with a suffocating tension. We bolted. None of us cared about being quiet anymore. We just ran, crashing through the trees, not daring to look back. But the chanting followed us, echoing through the forest, growing louder and louder as if they were right behind us. As we stumbled back into our campsite, we heard footsteps, a lot of them. In the darkness, we could see shadows moving between the trees, closing in on us from all sides. Desperate, we grabbed our backpacks, leaving everything else behind, and started running again, heading toward the main trail that led back to our car. But the forest seemed endless, the trees twisting and closing in around us as if trying to trap us. The chanting never stopped, growing fainter and louder in waves, as if those figures were weaving through the woods, playing some kind of sick game. Finally, we saw the faint outline of the trail. We burst out of the trees and onto the path, sprinting as fast as we could until we saw the glint of our car in the moonlight. Without a second thought, we piled in, locking the doors, and sped down the winding forest road. As we drove away, I looked back, half expecting to see those figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty forest, bathed in an eerie silence. Finally, we saw the faint outline of the trail. We burst out of the trees and onto the path, sprinting as fast as we could until we saw the glint of our car in the moonlight. Without a second thought, we piled in, locking the doors, and sped down the winding forest road. As we drove away, I looked back, half expecting to see those figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty forest, bathed in an eerie silence. None of us spoke the entire drive back. The strange chanting still echoed in my mind, haunting me long after we'd left the forest behind. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes hear it in my dreams, a low, hypnotic hum, calling me back to that dark, twisted campfire in the woods. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I see shadows moving outside my window, as if someone, or something, is still watching, waiting for the moment when I finally let my guard down. It started as a small curiosity. Every evening around the same time, my cat, Luna, would vanish. It didn't matter what she was doing, sleeping, playing, or eating. As soon as the clock struck 6 p.m., she'd perk up, trot to the door, and meow insistently until I let her out. She'd slip out into the fading sunlight, and no matter how hard I tried to follow her, she always seemed to disappear into thin air. By midnight, she'd be back, calm and composed, as if nothing unusual had happened. I chalked it up to her being a cat with an adventurous spirit. Cats have their little mysteries after all. But as the weeks went by, Luna's behavior grew stranger. She'd come back later and later, her sleek fur sometimes matted or covered in dust, her eyes wide and a bit haunted. And there were other things too. Scratches along her side, a strange smell of dirt or smoke lingering on her fur. It was like she'd been exploring places no one had been to in ages. One night, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was going to follow her. So, when 6 p.m. rolled around, I quietly slipped on my coat and grabbed a flashlight. As Luna gave her usual insistent meow, I opened the door for her and watched as she sauntered down the steps, her tail flicking in excitement. I waited until she was a few paces ahead before slipping out after her, making sure to keep a safe distance. She led me down our street, through the quiet, shadowed sidewalks, then veered into an alleyway I'd never noticed before. The alley seemed unusually dark, lined with abandoned buildings and fences covered in tangled vines. I lost sight of her briefly, but caught a glimpse of her tail flicking around the corner of an old brick building. I hurried to catch up, my footsteps echoing softly against the cracked pavement. By the time I rounded the corner, Luna was nowhere to be seen. I shone my flashlight around, scanning the empty lot, the boarded-up windows, the overgrown weeds swaying in the evening breeze. I started to wonder if I'd lost her. Then I spotted something, a tiny opening between two rusted fences, just big enough for a cat to slip through. With a deep breath, I squeezed myself through, ignoring the prickling sensation of the metal scraping my coat. Beyond the fence was a hidden path, winding through trees and brush, leading deeper into what felt like forgotten parts of the town. As I ventured forward, I realized the area looked odd, like something out of an old photo. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches casting eerie shadows that danced in the dim light. Every so often, I'd catch a flash of Luna's eyes reflecting in the darkness, but she always stayed just out of reach, moving deeper and deeper. After what felt like an eternity, the path opened up into a clearing, and I froze. In the center of the clearing was a strange, crumbling stone structure, like an ancient shrine or altar. Vines and moss covered its surface, and strange symbols were carved into the stone, worn with age but still faintly visible. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like rust. And there, in the center of it all, was Luna. She sat on the edge of the altar, her eyes wide and unblinking,
staring at something just out of the beam of my flashlight. Her fur was puffed up, her back arched, but she made no sound. She was transfixed, as if under a spell. I took a cautious step closer, calling her name softly, but she didn't seem to hear me. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, a soft hum that filled the clearing. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A low, almost melodic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained to listen, my heart pounding as the hum grew louder, transforming into what sounded like words, though I couldn't understand them. Luna's gaze flicked toward me, her eyes filled with something I could only describe as urgency. She gave a soft meow, her voice echoing strangely in the clearing. I took another step forward, my foot crunching on something hard and brittle. I glanced down, shining my flashlight at the ground, and felt my stomach twist. Bones. Scattered around the base of the altar were small animal bones, picked clean and arranged in strange patterns. Some of them looked ancient, bleached white by time, while others looked fresh. My hands trembled and I took a shaky step back, but Luna's gaze held me in place. She looked at me, then at the altar, as if trying to tell me something.
Then, out of the darkness, I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its features were obscured in shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight in an unnatural way. The hum grew louder, and the figure began to move, gliding silently toward the altar. It didn't walk. It seemed to float, its feet never touching the ground. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure reached the altar and stopped, its gaze shifting between Luna and me. Then it raised a long, skeletal hand, pointing directly at me. The hum became a whisper, echoing in my mind, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt as if I was being pulled forward, closer to the figure, closer to whatever darkness lay beyond its shadowed face. Luna's yowl snapped me out of it. She leapt off the altar, positioning herself between me and the figure, her fur bristling, her tail lashing. She hissed, a low, guttural sound that I'd never heard from her before, and the figure froze. It seemed to hesitate, its gaze shifting to Luna as if weighing its options. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure melted back into the shadows, disappearing into the trees. The hum faded, leaving only the quiet rustle of leaves in its wake. Luna turned to me, her eyes wide and filled with relief, as if she'd just saved me from something I couldn't begin to understand. I didn't wait to find out what that something was. Scooping Luna into my arms, I sprinted back through the path, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I was safely back home, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the couch, my heart racing. Luna stayed by my side that night, curled up against me, her eyes half closed but always watchful, as if guarding me from whatever I'd seen in that clearing. The next evening, when 6 p.m. rolled around, Luna didn't ask to go outside. She stayed close to me, purring softly, as if telling me that whatever had called her to that strange altar was now gone. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint hum, echoing in the back of my mind, and I wonder if it's truly over, or if something is still watching, waiting for us to return. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.